Hey guys, so have you ever had this problem? You're working on your drum mix, right? You're trying to push up the levels, trying to compete with the bass, the guitar, and the keys. And the drums, they're just not cutting through. You're trying to push them up more. You can see that the faders, everything looks like it's loud, but you can't hear it. It's just kind of like a mushy sound, right? You're trying to compress it more. The more you compress it, maybe it's even getting worse. You don't know what's going on. Well, today we're going to take a look at this. We're going to look at why this is happening, especially if you're doing inline compression. And we're going to really focus on a technique called parallel compression or New York style compression. And we're going to see how this can help your drums to get pushed up harder in the mix without them losing this sonic fidelity. Okay, so let's jump into it. We're going to deconstruct a mix that I have. This is something I had done for one of my bands previously. I used parallel compression on this already, so we're going to see what kind of effect that has. We're going to compare this against using just compression inline. But before we jump into it too much, let's just listen to hear what some of the different parts of the song are. So I have one part right here. I have some of the high tom going on. We got this part over here. We got some straight double bass. Obviously, there's guitar solo going on. If we jump earlier in the song, we got some groove. All right, so let's talk about inline compression first, kind of like a serial approach. And we're going to discuss some of the pitfalls that you run into and why you run into those issues sonically, what problems you end up having with them. To do this, let's first jump back to that section that I had with that tom. And we're going to throw some compression on that track. And we're going to listen to what happens when I really crank up the compression there. Okay, so I'm going to solo the track. I've thrown up the UAD style 1176 compressor. So let's just throw this thing up. Let's take a listen. So right off the bat, there's one thing going on. Now that I got the compression cranked, it's starting to sound a little weird. Obviously the cymbals that are bleeding in through the mic, that's cutting up as well. But sonically, the sound of the drum is a little bit different than how it was. If I bypass the compressor and I try to make the levels a little bit more even between the original and without the original before the compressor's on and once the compressor's on, you can kind of hear how it's sonically changing it, right? So if it's off, on, it's starting to sound like a little weird, almost like it's starting to sound like a little distant, right? It's not now in that distant sound. That means that once it's in the mix, it's gonna have some problems. It's not gonna really be cutting through as well as it would have. Let's try this on some other instruments. So let me go into one of my bass drum tracks. I actually have a compressor on this already. That's also an 1176. So first with the compressor off, and then on. So you can hear it, it doesn't sound the same as it did before. So what happens when I go put this in the mix? All right, so if I have it off, so it's definitely louder, it's definitely cutting through more, but it's still not clear. And I have it compressed, to death, right? And it should really be popping out. So, what's the problem? What's going on? Even though I'm compressing it, it should be louder, right? Why isn't it so loud that it's really coming through? Well, the problem has to do with what happens sonically when you apply compression. So remember, what happens with compression? What was going on? You are compressing, you're reducing the dynamic range that you're working with, right? Usually you have some threshold, you have some sound, some stuff is quiet, is light, some stuff gets louder and goes above the threshold. And anything that is above the threshold, you're trying to squish it down, right? So this affects the sonic characteristic of, the amplitude of the sine waves as it's getting louder. And the way that it's affecting it is that what would normally be a nice, like sharp tone, especially for something snare wise, the attack of the bass drum for your toms, you would have a really, fast attack, right? The amplitude goes up quick, and then you have like a pretty quick release, right? And this shape, as you start to compress, it starts to like become more like squarish. Okay, you're really squeezing it down, and so a lot of the attack sound that you would get starts to go away, and that's going to affect how it sounds in the mix, even though you're sonically making it louder, right? It's taking up more. The bits have been turned on amplitude wise that it's going to technically be louder in the mix. The problem is that you're not going to hear it, right? Because the attack sound it's like the attack is like the consonant, all right? And then the low end, like that rumble stuff, is like the vowel. And with the vowels, how speech works, right? With the vowels is like how like you can sort of hear what's going on, but the consonants is where you get the clarity, is how you know like what words are being said. Well, with the same thing with this attack, right? What makes drums sound different from other instruments is in part the waveform, and when you greatly change the waveform like this, it doesn't sound the same, and it's not going to sound as good. So that is the problem with overcompression from inline compression. So this is where this parallel compression comes into play. So I'm going to put this compression back to how I had it before. We're going to take a look at what this parallel compression does. Okay, so I've set my bass drum compression back to how it was, and I shut off the one that I threw on the tom. So with parallel compression, what you usually do is you do little or no compression on the individual drums, and you do a massive amount of compression on a bus. So even the compression I actually have on right now might even be a little bit too hot for what you would, from a traditional parallel compression, but it seemed to work for me. So, experiment with yourself as well. But what you do is you don't throw compression on most of your stuff. So in fact, actually, this is going to save you a lot of processing, right? If you had compression on every single one of your tom tracks, for me, I double mic all my toms. I have 4 toms, so there's 8 tracks, right? So that would be 8 more compressors I'd have to have. By not using all those compressors, if you're using, say, waves, then that's, CPU that you're not having to use up. If you're using UAD, then that's, that dedicated hardware you're not using up as much. What you do is you have another bus, and we'll call this, say, the drum compressor or drum comp bus. And you do a send on, say, every one of your drums, and whether or not you want to do your cymbals as well, that can get a little finicky sometimes. It can cause it to kind of maybe sound a little weird, so you have to experiment a little bit. You might have to pull down how much your send level is for your drum compression send to that bus. As you can see, in my case, for this little setup that I've done right now, I've flattened it out. I have it set up as post level, so the amount of fader in here is going to affect how much gets sent there. So, even though I have hi-hat and ride are technically going there, maybe I wouldn't really want to send that, but I also have the faders way down on those, so it's probably not going to be too hot anyhow. What is actually going on in here, right? So again, we consider the main drum tracks that we have that are going to our normal buses, right? So I have most of the drums are going to a drum bus, and the 2 bass drum tracks I have going to a separate bass drum bus. We consider these the dry tracks, right? So let's just take a listen to what this sounds like real quick. Right, so those are the drum buses, the dry ones. Then you separately, like I said, you have a drum compression bus. Let's just take a listen to what is going on, how this sounds real quick, and then I'll open up this plugin. Now listen to that. It sounds overly compressed, right? This is actually what we want to do here on this bus. So I'm using this API compressor. You might find that you actually might have to be cranking this even more. I'm actually doing a 10-to-1 ratio right now. I think I'm bringing down about 6 decibels. Yeah, it's peaking at about 6 decibels there. And it's definitely making a compressed sound. You know, again, we could even drive this more if we wanted to. And this is, like I said, this is the intended effect, right? Sometimes you might be using plugins and there's a wet, dry mix. This is effectively what we're doing here, but instead of it being in a single plugin, we're using the different buses that are set up to be able to control a wet, dry mix. So again, that drum, bass drum that we have, that's our dry. And that's going to have, you know, little to no compression, right? And then our where we're really cranking the compression is in this dedicated bus. So what you would do is you would work this up. You might have to, you know, maybe you would find, you know, maybe I want to change the EQ on this as well, or there's all sorts of other things that you can do in here. But you would kind of work up the drum compression sound. Once you have that drum compression sound, what you would do is, and I'm going to turn down this other bus for a second. You would take this guy and you would just bring him all the way down in the mix. You take your drum compression all the way out. And then you go to play the song with just the dry. And as you're listening back, you start to bring in the drum compression sound. All right, so let's try this. So as you can hear, hopefully, it's starting to really come through in the mix. But like let's listen to the snare drum for a second, right? So right now when I crank it up, the snare drum still sounds like a snare drum. It doesn't sound overly compressed in there. In fact, it sounds like really meaty. It's really cutting through. So why does this work? It's because, like I said before, when you do the compression in line, you're changing the sonic fidelity of that original signal, right? And you're really like slamming it down, right? You're kind of like almost squaring out some of the amplitude. Here, instead of trying to make the louds quieter and then bring the whole thing up, we're effectively trying to make the quiet louder. Right. So what are we doing? We're slamming the whole compression, right? Making it super compressed, but we're not affecting the original signal. We're not making that sound any different. And then we're taking that super compressed signal and we're just bringing it in. Now, right now, actually, the level that I have it here, this is probably up too much. But I just wanted to kind of demonstrate how the sound of this works. But you would basically feather it in to taste in part. You know, obviously you want to make sure that the drums are cutting, right? That they're coming through in the mix. But you know, you want to also make sure that they're still sounding good. Now, again, you can get a lot more compression out of your sound by doing this than trying to do everything in line. You might find that for certain things, like for me, I still find that I have to put some amount of compression on the bass drum and on the snare, and I actually usually compress those outboard as well. The amount of compression I'm doing outboard is somewhat minimal, I guess. I'm mostly trying to make sure I don't lose a good track. But, you know, I do separately compress those because those two signal sources I find are you know, very critical to how the mix works. The toms, if any of the cymbals going in, those can be, you know, those aren't as critical in the mix. Let's listen to some other parts in here and see how they sound with changing that drum compression level. The tom is like cutting way through. In fact, if anything, like, again, you know, this level is probably up too much. You know, maybe around here is probably a little bit better. Yeah, even for the snare, that's probably a better level. If I were to keep this drum bus at this level, I might have to go back to my tom, and maybe I'd need to not drive this so hot into the bus, right? So I could do that by, let me just move that plugin out of the way for a second, but I could just go in here and I could reduce, these are the sends to this compressor bus, right? So now if I play this, right? So that's a little bit better now, right? It's mixing in a little bit better. Now, of course, I could change the volume, or it looks like it's actually pretty hot, so I could have brought the faders down as well. But keep in mind that when you bring the faders down, you're going to be bringing down the amount of dry as well as how much you're sending to the wet. So just kind of keep that in mind if you're messing around with this, with the different sends and the different fader levels, and you start to find that maybe you're not getting the sonic clarity that you need. That could be because you don't have as much dry as that you need. So maybe you need to push the faders up a little bit and then pull down the sends. All right, let's go back to that groove part of the song and let's take a listen to that. Yeah, so once I'm really cranking that up, I mean, the snare is coming through like super clean. Now, if I felt that maybe the bass drum wasn't hot enough, you know, I could go back to just like the bass bus, and maybe I might want to bring up the dry there a little bit. So yeah, this is a great way to make sure that your drums are able to get through the mix. Sometimes you've got that wall of keyboards and bass and guitars that you got to try to get through, and it's sometimes hard to navigate with, you know, the panning and the frequencies that are available, and sometimes the drums just start to sound dead as you're trying to push it up, and that might be because you're just over compressing the dry source. So give this a try the parallel compression, and I think you will be pleasantly surprised at how much better and clearer your drum mixes are. So I hope you guys found that useful. Hope maybe you learned something. I'm putting out other videos like this, techniques on mixing drums, recording drums, and reviews on microphones and cymbals and sticks and all that sorts of stuff. So if you don't want to miss out on that stuff, then don't forget to subscribe. Also, I'd love to hear about other techniques that you guys might be interested in learning more about. If there's anything in particular you want to know about, then please let me know in the comments below. Until next time, peace.